Welcome to a Whirlybird Productions podcast with me, Helen Kirsten. We explore film finance and distribution, featuring insights from filmmakers, entertainment lawyers, and industry experts. Welcome to Clare Cahill. That's very kindly agreed to join me today. You are an independent producer and co-founder of Compos Mentis Productions, based in Bournemouth, I believe.
Yes.
And you have a slate of films which represent distinct voices, and you're also a lecturer at the Arts University in Bournemouth, which is fantastic. New generation of filmmakers coming along there with some really fantastic expertise from yourself. And you've been exploring, we're going to talk a bit about this today, new and emerging technologies in film production, what that can mean to new emerging filmmakers in particular. And your background, you're from New Zealand.
Yes, born in New Zealand, lived in the Pacific Islands for a period of time. In fact, it was in Samoa that I discovered the joy of storytelling. Polynesian culture operates very much on oral traditions and very long sagas that happen. But we lived up in the mountains, and we would occasionally get pirate TV signals. And one day, my mother said, "Come and watch this film. It's all about evolution." And it was 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Fantastic.
How's that about evolution?
That's a very big introduction to film.
At the age of 7.
Wow. Wowzers. What did you make of that?
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. It was black and white, little 12-inch television. So a little scratchy reception, interrupted, but just the magic of the story really, really got me. And so I thought, oh, I like this. And I was an avid reader as well. So every time I read things, I was trying to imagine how I would see them in film. So as I got introduced to the magic of film through the golden age of Hollywood and the films that we saw, I was just entranced by it. Unfortunately, though, we left Samoa, went to Australia, and in Australia, the industry is very closed. So it's a small industry, largely television. A lot of the way that the UK is going, unfortunately, a lot of domestic content is produced for television, not for cinema. And the content that is produced for cinema is for Hollywood, essentially. Australia got tied up with the I want to say the Marshall Agreement, but I think that was the agreement with the UK. But Australia got tied up with a trade agreement with the Motion Pictures Association and copyright rules. And so Australia voluntarily surrendered most of its quotas for local content. And so now the cinemas don't have any requirement to show local content, and so pretty much driven by American content. So Australia is, in terms of its local independent industry, is very small. Its industry for servicing Hollywood and co-productions is large, but the domestic is mostly television, and the UK has been going the same way in terms of. But there's no barrier to entry in the way that there is in Australia. So in Australia, it was very difficult to get work unless you had a union ticket, and it was very hard to get a union ticket unless you'd had work. So it's stuck. So I didn't have an opportunity to study at film school. I ended up doing a criminology degree, but I wanted to be a filmmaker. And around about 1997, I had a very serious medical incident. And as often happens when a medical crisis occurs, you reevaluate what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I thought, as much as I love trying to understand human nature through criminology, I really want to be a storyteller. So I abandoned my PhD and set about training myself in film. But it took me a while to break through. I joined a community channel, open channel in Melbourne and Victoria, to learn the basics of filmmaking. Then realizing I had a very golden thing called an Irish passport, I thought, well, I can move and go to this very vitally independent sector in the UK, because I'd read the Guerrilla Filmmakers Handbook. And so
so you thought that's the place to be.
That's the place to be. We can do it. Funnily enough, with the circle closing itself, a few years ago was encouraged to. I was working on a film, and I was encouraged to give some guest lectures at the Arts University in Bournemouth on scheduling and budgeting for independent filmmakers or low budget filmmakers. And so I did that, and that's how I ended up being offered a position as a lecturer, because I had a teaching background from Melbourne. And Chris Jones was an alumnus. So Chris Jones of the Guerrilla Filmmakers trained at, I think it was Arts University College in Bournemouth, I think at that point, or it might have been Bournemouth and Paul Arts Institute, Bournemouth. But same the circle keeps closing. And so came to the UK in 2007, full of intention to try to do some training, trying to do some short courses at NFTS or the Met or one of the film schools.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't really get the chance to. Exchange rate ate my money. So ended up with rain dance and shooting people. So going through that again, that very grassroots filmmaking training, but through that process, understanding how much of the grassroots was missing vital information. And that's where after a period of time, I applied to join the Production Guild. Mm-hmm. And that was difficult at that point because the Production Guild had a qualifying budget amount that one had to have worked on films equating to £2 million, or TV production equating to that. And the problem I had was that all the films I'd worked on were very low budget films or micro budget, nano budget films. So I very cheekily put an application in, and in the application I mentioned that I had 2,100,000 pound films. Wasn't that equivalent to 2 million? And Steve Clark Hall took me up on the logic and said, well, if you're going to make this case, then you have to show me that you know what you're doing. So we had a meeting where we went through a budget for a film I'd produced, Art Ache, which was 98,500. And he needed to show how I had been able to achieve that amount legally and properly. So on that basis, I was accepted into the Guild as the micro budget member for a period of time. And one of the things that I was asked to do was to talk to younger filmmakers about how to budget properly and how to schedule properly for lower budget films, because there's a finite pool of money, and when that money is gone, it's gone. And the film, if the film's not completed, the film's dead in the water.
So what do we mean? That's two good sort of thoughts there that I wanted to pick your brains about. When we're talking about low budget and we're talking about independent, we bandy these terms about, but what do we mean by that? What do they represent?
Well, independent, a film can start as independent because someone who's not connected to a broadcaster or to a studio has begun the process of making that film happen. So taking an idea that might be pitched through an early development script from a screenwriter or a director or an actor, and developing it up to a screenplay that is shootable, and then from that devising a budget to see whether we can achieve it, and then trying to raise the money. A lot of the time at that point, films fall over because there's no money to be had. So they either go and pitch it to a production company associated with a broadcaster or a production company associated with a studio, at which point you're surrendering the project to that person.
And that's that thing, isn't that IP is the movement that suddenly, yes, it was yours, it's now going on a journey with someone else.
Yeah, although it gets a little bit muddied because some of the studios began to recognize the value of the term independent. And so there was some muddying. So Fox Searchlight was apparently independent, but it's part of Fox. So it's not really to that extent. To the extent
it's a genre. Is it become a genre? It's sort of people
become,
sort of split it into a genre where actually it does have meaning, which is it's not part of a studio, it's not part of a broadcaster or a network or whatever. Yeah. It's independent of those bodies.
Exactly. The producers are financing it independently. It's not being financed by a studio with infrastructure. It's a complete small entity of its own that has to be able to come into being, do what it needs to do, and then resolve itself. So the independent film is in my mind, indicated by there's no financial support from a domain body. The producers are often very isolated, trying to work it out as they go without necessarily that big domain knowledge that an organization can have, that a broadcaster can have. So when you're working with a broadcaster, which I've never yet done, doesn't mean I haven't given up on the idea. There are producers who know how to do things. There are production coordinators who have resources at their fingertips. There are production managers who've solved many of these problems time and time before. But when you're an independent producer, these are the first time that you've often come in touch with those problems, and you're trying to find ways to solve them without that domain knowledge of someone solved it that way in the past. So it can be quite daunting for a lot of people. So when we talk about the budget levels, a low budget film, about 1 million, I would say, is a low budget film. And I've done.
And that's not low by most people's standards.
By most people's not low.
No.
So we talk about very low budget, and we're talking probably. Low budget. When you talk about the PAC definitions of low budget, a low budget is 3 million, 3 to 5 million. A very low budget is 1 to 3, or less than 1. But when we're talking about scale, we're talking potentially now micro budget films are less than 500,000, nano budgets are less than 100,000. Broadly speaking, as the costs of things escalate, those barriers become, or those borders become a little bit fluid. But in terms of thinking about nano budget filming, and no budget filming is where no one is being paid, only just the services can be paid for. And a no budget film is still going to be 15, 25, 35,000 pounds for a feature film. So because some things have to be paid for. So at some point we're talking about how much can we afford to pay the labor and how much can we afford to pay people.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's really important just to clarify so people understand, you know, where the landscape is of all these things. And I think then just to pick up on, you know, why is independent film important? If we're actually thinking a bit about this as a, you know, particularly important source of something in the film industry and artistically and culturally, what is it for you, and why do you think it's important? How is it important?
I think independent film is vital. It's the proving ground. It's the proving ground for ideas, for stories, for people to develop their voices as producers or directors or as artists. If we look at the BFI statistics, year on year, we see that the majority of films that are made are people who have stories to tell, and they fall within the independent low budget areas. Between 70 and 85% of all filmmaking activity that the BFI knows about is independent film. It's people who've got good stories to tell, and they are going to make those stories happen. So 10 to 15% is the studio films, the co-productions, the broadcaster sponsored films, and the big Hollywood films that come in. So year on year, we see people have stories that they need to tell. And that's what the avenue of independent film is, where those stories can find their life. And some of those independent films will escalate. So The King's Speech started out as an independent film, started out with Gareth Ellis Unwin and Tom Hooper, starting with this idea of adapting the play. And later the studios came on board, and later it became a studio film. But it began with the efforts of an independent producer who wanted to bring this story to life. So a lot of the independent films have passion behind them. And so it's not cynical about raising money for making money. It's about raising money to tell the story. So it becomes a lot more creatively honest and a lot of creative integrity involved. Anyone who thinks that they're going to make money from an independent film, you might, but it's incredibly unlikely. So one of the hardest things I had to do a few years ago was talk to a group of young actors who'd banded together and put a lot of money into making a really excellent project, which was based on Finnish storytelling, Finnish legends. And they'd made it, and they were proud of it, and they were taking it to Cannes to sell it. And I had to say to them, I don't want to burst your bubble, but when you sell it, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get money straight away. It means that you might have to pay money to get it sold, which is counterintuitive.
Yes, explain that. So what is that about? Are we talking about the distribution elements here? Yeah.
So I have a film that was made during the lockdown, and it's not a bad film. I came on later as a producer in second unit production. The director's funded it himself, and he did a lot of the work himself during the pandemic with his own camera, capturing the footage, capturing a lot of action footage, which looks really, really good. But then the story of the individuals had to be shot, and we did it over a weekend. Very intensive stuff, but there's about 10 minutes missing. So once I saw the final edit, I said, we're missing 2 story strands, and those story strands are critical to that story being understood by an audience. And I took it out to several distributors, and they said, we love it, we love it, we love it. Is it finished? And I said, no. And he said, yes. I'm right, it's not finished yet. And so one of the distributors said to us, well, we love the story, but there's storylines missing. So we would take it on, and we would be looking at £10,000. And so I said, okay, well, that's going to be a bit tricky. What the director heard was that they would be paying us £10,000 to distribute it. What they meant was that if we paid them £10,000, they would finish the film. So they would do the additional footage that needs to be collected, cut it, package it, send it out. So they would, and it was a very good deal, £10,000 to finish the film. Very good deal. It's just we didn't have £10,000 to do it. So the film has now ended up on Amazon Prime, not really doing much because it's not a complete story yet. It looks nice. It looks good, but it hasn't got the heart of the story there. And this again is one of the issues when we don't have an experienced story producer working with us. A lot of independent films lose that I want to say domain knowledge because I've said it so many times already, but that experience of a story producer who can say the audience needs this.
So important. I mean, it's interesting. I've listened to some other episodes in this series. There was an interview with Geraldine Maloney, and she was, saying exactly that. Who is your audience? Have you got a ready-made group of people that you've either nurtured through your relationship with them on social media? You've identified them. Are they existing, fan base, obviously, that can be then tapped into, and that people aren't always thinking about that. They're sort of thinking about it more personally. And that work's so important to be done really early on, isn't it? Just to get the foundations and know that this film is going to be demanded by somebody and watched.
It really is, because we've been brought up on the myth of the auteur director, and the auteur director is a producer director. But the thing that's really important is a really good trusting relationship between a producer and a director. And I made this mistake myself in the first films that I was working on, of thinking that the director was ultimately the final arbiter, but the director is the person who has something to say. And as I became more involved with what I was doing, I realized the role of the producer in this way is to stand in the place of the audience as we go through, so that I know who wants to hear it and I know what they want to hear. So the director is unfettered from what the audience wants and can be quite honest about the story that they want to tell. But I, as the producer, can shape that story for the audience. So I stand there to say, well, the audience needs this. The audience needs to know they're not going to read the script before they see the film, so they're not going to get the subtext. We need to reveal the subtext as we go. So I'm there with my blinkers on going, I don't get it, which I do get it because I'm the producer, but as an audience person, I'm not getting it. So, and that's really important. When we come to the edit, we need to have made sure that we've got the editing options, because we can't go back and reshoot, because by that time we don't have any money left. So again, it's really important to do that pre-visualization process with people who are often very inexperienced directors who aren't aware. It might be their first film and they're not aware of the things that they haven't yet learned, particularly the importance of making sure that you can look at the performance you get on set, but it's going to be different when you look at it in the edit. What you remember from the memory that you got on set is not necessarily what's going to be there in the rushes. So if you've locked yourself into a particular set of shots and you don't have that flexibility, then we're going to be trying to fix it in the edit. We're not going to be able to expose and reveal the story. We're going to be constructing the story. Yeah,
and I suppose that the irony is that this is in a sense, almost like viewed as the nursery slopes, isn't it? You're in this sector. This is where you're going to learn everything. But actually, because you don't have that infrastructure of the studio and all of that machinery and that knowledge and that experience behind you, it is really difficult then, because you're going to learn this the really hard way, aren't you? Probably by the mistakes that you've and learned.
It's expensive, and trying to do it again and again and again is going to be really, really difficult. People think that it's very easy to make a film. It's really not easy to make a film. And in some ways it's easier when you don't have very much money, because you don't have very many choices. So you have to make the best choices you can. There's a point at which I say, we're really looking for the comfortably uncomfortable budget, because it means that your choices are contained and you work with the best that you can, rather than trying to look for a choice that may not be the best for the situation you're in.
So that framing of, therefore, because of this, we will be doing this. That sort of really clear vision.
So there's no point trying to have a big stunt because we can't do it well. So instead of having a big stunt, how are we going to convey that part of the story in a meaningful way that doesn't look naff on screen, which gives the emotional intent that we were looking for.
I mean, that's again where the innovation comes. And I think that's, it seems like from what you've been telling me previously, things like virtual production might hold some of the key to unlocking some of these challenges. Tell me a bit about what you've been doing with virtual production, what you're looking at there.
Well, it's part of a pathway, really. The thing that enabled us to get into film in the first place was the evolution of digital cameras and the the drop in price of the digital cameras and the development of Premiere Pro for editing and Final Cut for editing. And so that although people talk about it as a form of democratization, it's a form of access rather than democratization, because just because you can do it doesn't mean you're going to make a good film. But the first film that we made, it was a riotous, surreal explosion that was just, we threw everything in the kitchen sink at this particular film. And of course, it's done what it needed to do, but it never went very, very far. But it enabled us to start thinking about what can we do when we don't have any money and we have to be creative. And so it was a very surreal film. And we worked with a very early green screen. We had a portable green screen. We worked with that, and we began looking at how we could integrate Photoshop into our films. So very early pipelines. So probably keeping pace with what Richard Linklater was developing in terms of rotoscoping. So over the last little while, we've been looking at the way that virtual production occurred, and particularly during the pandemic. So we were starting to look at some of the virtual reality, some of the augmented reality technologies and game engines, and looking at the possibilities for creating the types of effects that we couldn't afford, the types of things like using sprites as crowd, so cutouts of people effectively to fill in crowd scenes. So we began looking at game engines around about 2016, 2017, and they weren't anywhere near what we needed them to be at that point. But over the last little while, through the company, we've been investing in how we can look at what's been going on with virtual production in the bigger world. And it's a complex case, because the business case for virtual production is clear. It's cheaper to scan people and put them into a background and to have
and safer, depending on the stunts and things. And
then you have your big actors, your named actors, acting in front of the screen, and you've got the technology that connects the computer generated background, which is projected onto the screens, with the foreground that is captured by the camera. Now that's great, but it's also very expensive, and it's more expensive and wasteful than it needs to be. So we'd begun looking at how could we create scans as soon as the fidelity was available. How could we create scans of faces to put them into our films? Now, the issue here is the business case, and the business case is not healthy, because the business case is, well, you can scan a person once and you can use them forever. And that then decimates the creative industries, and that's not what I'm about, and not what my company is about. And so what we're looking at doing is creating virtual backgrounds, but they're not good if we have to film with real people, because we still have to hire studios, which are very expensive. The rate for virtual production at the moment is anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 pounds a week. I can't afford that. That's a whole film. So what we've been looking at is, how do we use the technology now to scan people's faces, have them puppet the performance, so we've got something that we can show. And this is what Disney, ILM, Warner Brothers, they're all researching and developing this as well. But we're doing it from a point of view to make it more accessible for independent filmmakers to access this technology. But the ethics have to be absolutely crystal. And this is where we are. This is what has been the substance of the SAG dispute, and the SAG dispute is not yet completely resolved. It's got a hiatus perhaps, but this issue will come up again, because there is no technical way to block someone from using my data if I have my face scanned. There's no technological way. Even if we were able to do something with a blockchain, that would still be environmentally difficult to do that. So what I need is the same promise that producers give me if I'm acting physically. If I'm acting physically, producers promise me that for my performance in this film, my performance is connected to this particular film. So when I sign my copyright, it's connected. So
it's sort of like PRS type payments, performing rights type repayment for having been in that original source material. Okay.
So this is something that that we've been lobbying the Production Guild to take on board, to say we need to be driving an ethical statement to say that if we are using AI moderated film, not AI generated, so we're not generating, we're generating from a person, so we're scanning a person's face, but we're using AI to be able to get that person to then puppet their face. So AI moderated content, we need to promise the people who have given us permission to do that we will only do it for that film or for the project that they've been signed off, that there will be equitable remuneration for the work that they have done, and there will be royalty payments for continued reuse.
And what do you mean by puppet as well, just to pick up on that?
So if I've got a scan of my face, then I've got there's a piece of software I can use, which is now being shown around the place. It's being used in gaming at the moment. So I have my scan. My scan is inert, but as I move, it then maps the way that I move onto the scan of my face. So it looks naturalistic. It's not perfect yet, but it's getting closer all the time.
Mm.
But given that when we take two-dimensional footage of someone, we're scanning them anyway, because you look at people when they represent on film. So on film, I look like I have a really large round face, but in real life, I don't have as round a face as I look in camera because the camera is scanning me imperfectly. So it really is the suspicion about deep fakes and the suspicion about misuse of my image that is driving this. And I completely understand it. And as an ethical producer, I make that commitment, but I need the trust between myself and the performers that I will be true to my word, because there is no way that we can guarantee that there's a technical solution that could block it from happening.
Yeah, I get you. So it is it's an evolving practice, isn't it? Ethically, legally, artistically, and in terms of technology. It's something that is, it's already in motion. It's obviously not something that's going to stop. And environmentally, I'm sure, people will agree, there are many benefits from not necessarily moving things around to go to another location, all of that carbon.
Throwing cars off cliffs. Why do we have to do that realistically?
We don't really need to be throwing things off of cliffs. So, I can see from your point of view, for the independent sector that's really valuable. And that provided there is that agreement that is ethical, legally robust and fair, that is a great thing to do in the future. So, moving back to sort of talking about where the funds exist currently for filmmakers like yourself, what is the landscape like? What are there are some well-known sources, I'm sure, but I'm just wondering, what's your experience been? Where would you go, and what is the situation like?
Well, one of the first books that I read was Kill a Life by Christine Vachon, and she's one of my heroes, actually. She's one of the inspirations for me getting into film production and wanting to become a producer. And so she gave many, many cautionary tales about the if you don't have a good lawyer and you don't have a good accountant, you're going to get burned. And that is the truth of it. So in a way, one of the things that that we've had to do is work in order to fund our films ourselves. It's very difficult to raise money for film production, particularly as an independent person. However, it's about understanding why you're doing it, what you're doing it for, and being very careful about the budget of it. So in terms of how we've financed our films, it's been about going out working, saving money, and then very carefully using that money. We've applied to the BFI in the past. A lot of the time we would have people sitting around going, oh, but there's lots of money. The BFI has lots of money. Well, they may have, but they don't. And I don't know very many people who have actually successfully achieved BFI money. So the number of people who achieve it is very, very low compared to the number of people who are trying to make stories. So the thing that I've learned through experience is that the BFI has a very limited pot of money that it can distribute, and that pot, when it's given to a certain number of people, becomes a smaller pot of money. But what I began to suspect, which I think has been validated by the way the BFI has changed its funding regime, was that the emerging filmmaker definition wasn't a person making their first film, it was a person making their first commercial film. So in order to be an emerging filmmaker, you had to have already emerged and have a track record so that you were a safe pair of hands. But unfortunately, I don't think they were ever able to say that in the terms of the award outright. So they would say it's a filmmaking fund for emerging filmmakers. So all of us emerging filmmakers would rush out there saying, please, can we have some money? But the issue that I've raised with the BFI is that there is a lack of transparency in the decision-making process. So you just get a yes or a no, and it's very hard to get feedback so that you as an independent producer can understand where you're lacking and take remedial action. The people I think who have been more successful are people who have come in at the BFI at a very low level. So starting with BFI Network, doing short films or development and building up a relationship with the BFI to do that. So I've applied to the BFI a number of times, and not yet been successful. Well, ironically, I have been successful, but not for film funding. My company has been given some money for a business development fund, but not for a film development.
Again, you might think, oh, actually, you know, there are different sorts of funding available. As you say, for the business side, perhaps the training that you might need. There are other funds, depending on what we're talking about, maybe from a union, maybe from, you know, Screen Skills or whatever, you know, bursaries, etc. But actually making the film is still the challenge.
The making the film is the challenge, and there's no easy answer to that. There's no easy answer at all. One of the things that I have done is I have done some crowdfunding in the past for long shorts. I haven't done a crowdfunding for a feature. The two features that I produced were both being self-funded by the exec producers. So in terms of the money, my job there was not obtaining the money. My job was making sure that the exec producers didn't go bankrupt. So the first film was
managing the money.
Exactly. The first film, the director was funding himself. And so I had to say to him, my job here as a producer, if you want to fund this yourself, because he'd been looking to raise money and he hadn't succeeded in raising money either, in going around looking at what he needed to do. And so he'd said, right, that's it. I'm just going to make this film. And he squirreled together an amount of money. He had 50,000 on the table. And I said, I don't think that's going to be enough, but I need to do a budget to be able to tell you. The problem was that he didn't know what a budget was, and many people don't know what a budget is. A budget is not, how am I going to spend the money I have? A budget is, what does the film need to get made? And then I go back and say, all right, well, what do I have? What can I cut? Or what do I have to raise more money for, or think strategically about? So a lot of people think about the budget as in, how will I spend the money I have? And that's where so many films fall over, because they
rather than the inception of the idea, thinking, right, okay, this will require this amount, therefore I've got to frame it around what is likely to be the case in terms of number of characters, the location. I know you've mentioned about, you know, choosing that very carefully, you know, exteriors, you were saying.
Yeah, so the thing is that the first thing that we have to do as independent filmmakers is work out exactly, we've got to face the devil and say, how much do you need? And that's a hard question to ask when we've got a director who is really determined to make the film, and that passion is necessary, but it's important that that passion is contained, because otherwise we rush into production before we're ready. And that has happened on so many of the projects I've worked on, because as soon as we've got the money, the green light amount, let's spend it before it gets spent on something else. Oh, we should have taken another little bit longer to see if we could raise a bit more. So in this particular case, I had to double the budget that the director thought that he was going to work with. And I said to him, I need to know that this money you put on the table, if I just take it and I rip it up and throw it in the air, are you going to go bankrupt? And he said, no. I said, will it hurt? And he said, well, yes, it will hurt, but at least I won't be homeless. And I said, well, in that case, we can go ahead. But if he was mortgaging himself, or if he was doing something where he was going to be financially challenged, I couldn't have taken it in all conscience, because he would never see that money back. And even now, 10 years later, he hasn't seen that money back. So, but that was an investment in himself. As long as he understood that he wasn't making money, he wasn't spending money to make money, but he was spending money to make a calling card film, then that works. So, which is a real shame. The system is not good. It's a really harsh system in terms of trying to get to survive. The second film I produced was being funded again by the producers, and this was to be a film to showcase martial arts fighting style, using Shaolin fighting style. And so in that case, the exec producers were raising the money through sales of DVDs, training DVDs in martial arts, and classes, teaching classes. And so my job then again, as the producer, was not to go and find the money that doesn't exist. My job was to make sure that the money that we had got spent appropriately. This is where the nature of the independent producer is a little bit different to, say, a person putting the deals together in a 1 million plus, where you've got to think about tax credits, and you've got to think about tax incentives, and the ways in which you'll structure the funds, and who's got the mezzanine level, and who's got completion funding, and who's got all the bits. It's a lot different in independent producing. It's really, you find the money, you manage the money. The money can come from different places, but you're really not always going to be the person sourcing that money or setting up those agreements.
Yeah, so we've got some fireworks currently. We've had those throughout this. It's November. There's lots of fireworks. Fireworks in fireworks for filmmaking. That's it. We've always got fireworks. We've got some pyrotechnics of our own. So I'm sort of think, looking back, what would you have told yourself if you could have done when you were starting out now? What are those hard-won lessons about funding and distribution that you really feel like these are the key messages for people?
To take more time with the script, to make sure the story is better. The script can be a good script. Even in good production, even in well-budgeted productions, a good script can still turn into mush on the set, just by actors not really having the time to rehearse with directors to come into the characters correctly, because independent films or low-budget films is going to carry on the performance of the actors, because we can't afford the types of production design elements that bigger films can. So it's going to really, really need the actors to carry and transport the films.
Hence why actors still like to be on these films, because they are at the center of it. They can perform and immerse themselves and take on those really important roles.
So more of that is what I really would have liked to have done. So it's that thing that just taking that extra bit of time, to prepare. There's never enough pre-production that's done, and so we end up having to rush things on set. We end up having to cut things on set, and that's when you get to the edit, you've already lost your film. So pre-production is really, really important. Understanding what a budget is, understanding how to schedule, and not scheduling on hope, but scheduling on realities. So one of the things about going into the guild was talking with Steve about the way that and Alison about the way that I scheduled. I don't schedule on pages per day. A lot of the time on bigger productions, because there's a lot of infrastructure, you can get a good average of how many pages per day you can shoot, but you can't do that on a lower budget film. You need to schedule on the number of setups that you're going to have each day, because you don't have the swing gang who can be preparing the next set. You've got to be in the moment. You've arrived today, you've set up today, you're shooting today, you're wrapping up today. Anything you don't get today, it's gone. So it's really, really about understanding you've got to have the time in to let people come in and do the work that they do. And yes, it's going to cost you a little bit more, but if your film is that fragile, cut that scene. So if your film is that fragile, focus on what you can do well rather than trying to spread yourself too thin.
Brilliant. So that pre-production, spend time, really, really plan your budget, understand how you're going to manage those finances and keep it on track, and have a really dedicated bunch of people to help you do it, presumably.
And a lot of the time your film is not going to make you money. So you've got to be willing to just lose that money. You can't make commitments to people that you will be able to return the money to them, because you cannot.
Yeah, there's been bad practice in that area, hasn't there? That nobody's, had a fee, but they're promised a fantastical thing, and somebody is rinsing some fund and is getting some sort of fee, or
they've just made hopeful promises and they've all gone broke. One of the directors that I worked with did exactly that, because a certain chunk of money disappeared from the film. One of the investors pulled out just before the film was about, and we were already the day before shooting, and so we had to make it work. And I had to meet the crew and say, there's no money in this film, but everything's here. So we can continue making the film. At least the film can get made, unless you've got work. If you've got work, go and take work. But if you don't have work, stay with me and let's at least make the film, or make the bits of the film we can make, because at least that way the producers have an even chance of finishing the film. And then there's something that gives us an IMDb credit. It gives us the experience that we've done.
Yeah.
If we stop the film now, which is within our rights to do, then we don't get any of that. It just becomes a black hole in the middle of 6 weeks we've spent in pre-production. Black hole. And
but at least you're bringing them into that decision. You're saying to people, look, this is the reality. It's that honesty, isn't it, that you need for people to make that choice.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, and I think that's probably where the value of the producer is, because I think for a lot of the time, if you can get past this idea that the passion of the director is the be all and end all, the passion of the director is what pulls us forward. But the director has to be has to be able to do that. The director has to say, yes, I want, but they have to be able to accept that at some point we are going to hit a boundary. And when we hit that boundary is a boundary. And all the hoping in the world is not going to make things change. So from the producing point of view, it's about saying, okay, you hope that you'll be able to pay back, but you cannot promise, because you don't have control over that. That you are not going to be given money at the end of this. You're going to be hawking it around the place, trying to sell it, and selling it might mean having to pay £10,000 of your own money to get it out into the market. Get it into the market. How are you going to pay people if you're paying back that £10,000 first?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, sort of thinking about the sort of current situation of where we're at with independence. I did read something recently. It was talking about how those tax incentives are now, they're sort of taking away the space that might have been there for independence. Just tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
One of the things that we had, 2012, I think, is where things began to change. But the evolution of the Seed and Enterprise Investment Scheme, which was effectively lower budget producers could speak to investors who had a tax debt that was going to be paid, and we could borrow their tax money as long as HMRC approved us. We could borrow their tax money and we could use it to make films. The issue was that, again, a lot of people said, well, if I can get an EIS, which is up to 5 million, 3 million, 5 million, I can make a 3 million, 5 million pound film out of it. And of course, HMRC says, well, that's not a good risk ratio. We want you to make a slate of films. So if one of those films makes it, it covers the costs of the other films. But the seed investment was lower level again. And that was where people were starting to churn out these very low budget films, but they weren't making anything. And so that got, I think, taken over by the BFI a little while ago. And so now it's really impossible for independent producers to create an SEIS. There was a lot of financial information that needed to be provided, but it was aimed at unsophisticated investors. And so the amount that any individual person could contribute was capped. So it was really, really wonderful lifeblood for independent film to be able to say, well, the government is investing in us this way. Now we're in the situation where the government is not investing in us through the SEIS, and it's not investing in us through the lottery schemes. So it's the passion of the independent producers that is keeping that sector vital and alive. It's the passion of the people who are willing to help someone make a story that is keeping that alive, and it's vital to us. We've seen that with SAG, with the strike happening, how much we ground to a halt, because we don't have that support of our domestic industry. We don't have the ability to turn that money towards the people who have got stories to tell and finance the people who've got those stories to tell. We instead said, oh, the Americans will get over it very shortly. So in the meantime, all the grips can go on benefits, all the camera assistants can turn to advertising. Very, very sadly, I know many people who have developed really serious mental health issues and existential issues as a result of having their income suddenly just stop dead.
Wow. Yeah, and it's just that dependency, isn't it? There isn't that independency anymore. It is dependency. So, you know, where do you see things, you know, in the near future? What's your thought about the state of things for independent producers like yourself? Where are we going to, do you think, or hope or fear? I don't know.
It's I think we need to keep doing what we're doing. In the first thing, I think we need not to give up hope, because there is always that chance that one of our films will make it, and make it fairly well. So keep making good stories as producers. Keep finding those young directors with the good stories to tell. Build up your own knowledge as a producer, so that you can be that person who can help someone develop a good story and give them the experience they need to make sure that it's something the audience want. One of the things that we're looking at is different ways in which we can get our content distributed. So starting to understand, how can I get my content directly to my market? And this is where crowdfunding can actually have a positive role to play, because crowdfunding is not just about raising the budget for the film, it's also about starting that conversation with your audience. And so with one of the longer short films that I made that was entirely funded by crowdfunding, the relationship that we developed with the audience was so strong that they were willing to pay to come and see the film if it was put on in different cinemas or different venues. And I think that's one of the things that instead of chasing the distributors, spend a bit more
directly
time
trace the audience, engage the audience. Yeah, is that relationship's much closer, isn't it?
Yeah, so the platforms that are available at the moment are the traditional crowdfunding, and they've only been around 10 years. So Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, I think Indiegogo is not so much used anymore, but also Patreon, which is one of the, it's probably a bit more difficult for a film producer to think about, because it relies on a model where you commit to an audience who will pay you a regular amount to keep moving towards your creative journey. So I was aware of there was a web series that was developed, Ren, the Girl with the Mark, that was funded by crowdsourced. So the crowd came together to make the film, and for their second series, they also were able to crowdfund it and started looking at Patreon as a way to develop a core of their audience who would contribute an amount weekly to allow the film to go through pre-production. So we being a bit more creative about, I mean, for the moment, I've been going out just working and putting the money aside and trying to bring costs down and be creative about that. But crowdfunding is definitely something that I'm not allergic to in terms of things moving forward.
So if a sort of nice sort of wrap up statement, you know, could you find 3 words that sum up what it takes to maintain and forge that career in independent film? What 3 traits or qualities or
Number
whatever?
1, you must love films, must love stories. So number 1, passion.
Yeah.
Passion. Number 2, persistence. Just keep going at it. Just keep plugging away at it. And one day you will be the person that succeeds. It's not about giving up. And number 3 is making time for self-care, you know, making time to, because the type of person who wants to get it made will often take on too many responsibilities of other people and it's got to be a joint effort. It's got to be collaborative between, firstly, myself and my director together. We've got to collaborate together effectively. And then as other people come in, bringing them into that collaborative journey. Yes, I'm responsible, but I'm not liable. It's the thing that, thinking about how we bring the team together and we make it as a team.
That team playing. Yeah. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time and your insights to really share with people hard-won experience. You know, you can't get hindsight until
you've done it
until later, sadly. And I think as much as everyone's experience might be, you know, it's their own journey, there's some really important points that you've made that I think will help people on this journey. And those last 3 sort of themes that you picked up on, what it takes to sustain yourself, and you know what you need, that passion, that kind of determination or doggedness in your pursuit, and also that you lean on others, you know, that you are, that's what we love, we're in a team, that's what we all kind of like, collaboration is king. Thank you very, very much. It's been brilliant. And I hope to see some of your work coming out soon. Have you got something that sort of, there's always something in the pipeline?
Yeah, I've got the first India UK co-production happening at the moment, and we're looking to go into production next year. It's been really quite a difficult journey. Again, this is a £3 million budget, and again, it's very difficult to raise the money for it in the UK. You wouldn't think that, but yes, it's difficult to do that. So, but we are moving forward, and it looks like we are close to closing the gap. So we should be able to green light it. Just before Christmas, I expect we should be able to green light it.
That's so brilliant. Well done. You've definitely persisted by the sounds of it in the face of obstacles.
Well, this one started in 2018, so it's been that journey. And the second is a virtual production feature, which is entirely made in the games engine, game engine technology, real-time technology. So again, using scans of faces that actors and voice actors will puppet for them. That we hope to be releasing January, February time. So that's being made with 3 people. So that's not a bad effort.
That's amazing. Plus you are a lecturer and doing so much for another generation of filmmakers. So thank you. And thank you for today. Much appreciated. Have a lovely evening. And please do check in with us again. Keep us up to date. Tell us what we need to know.
Will do. Thank you.
All right.
If you're enjoying this content and you're finding it valuable, please subscribe to our Patreon page. Without your contribution, the podcast will come to an end. You can find the link through our website, Whirlybird Productions, filmfinance.podcast or our Instagram page, Film Finance Podcast, and follow the link in the bio. Thanks for listening.